Chapter 10, Allowing Someone to Die, Mercy Death, and Mercy Killing. Chapter 10 is actually a continuation of the discussion that we began when we looked at Chapter 9. In Chapter 9, we talked about those occasions when it might be morally acceptable to take a human life. In this chapter, we are going to begin to look at bioethics, medical ethics. And doctors and medical professionals across the country, across the world, have to make life and death decisions every day. Should we begin treatment? Should we discontinue treatment and allow someone to die? Nowadays, there is a great enthusiasm among some for the idea of assisted suicide. The authors of our textbook refer to this with a euphemism, mercy death. But what we're talking about is a terminally ill patient who asks a medical professional to either terminate his life or to help him do it. And then mercy killing. That is a little bit different and certainly controversial. This involves determining that someone's life is not worth living. And then that life is taken. Either the state requires it or the state permits it. These are three big issues in bioethics, and this is the subject we're going to be considering in Chapter 10. We want to begin by defining some key terms. First, euthanasia, because this is what we are talking about. Originally, euthanasia meant good death. But more recently, it has come to refer to mercy killing. Although all of the things we are going to be talking about in this chapter could technically fall under that category of euthanasia. We begin by talking about allowing someone to die, and sometimes this is referred to as passive euthanasia. This involves not starting curative treatment when there is no cure. It involves stopping treatment when there is no longer any hope of curing a dying patient. It means allowing a patient to die a natural death without any interference from medical science. The next term we want to discuss is mercy death. Mercy death is a euphemism for assisted suicide. Mercy death is the taking of a direct action in order to terminate a patient's life because the patient has voluntarily requested it. So we are not just allowing nature to take its course here. We are actually doing something intentionally to end the life of the patient. The authors of our text say it's essentially an assisted suicide. Yeah, it is an assisted suicide. We use euphemisms when we're uncomfortable with the subject, and there are a lot of areas in bioethics that make us uncomfortable. And so rather than talking about assisted suicide, we use a euphemism. Notice also termination of the patient's life. What are we talking about? Well, we're talking about killing a patient. But that sounds a little stark, doesn't it? And so we soften the emotional blow by talking about mercy death, and we talk about terminating a patient's life. But what we're talking about is killing a patient who is usually terminally ill, though there might be other reasons for this as well. We're talking about killing this person because the person has asked us to do it. Now, mercy killing is the next step. This is taking a direct action to euthanize a patient, to terminate a patient's life, to kill the patient, without his or her permission. Someone else is deciding that this life is not worth living, and so the decision is made by someone other than the patient to put the patient out of his or her misery. Brain death. Brain death occurs when a patient has a normal heartbeat and respiration, but has suffered irreversible and total brain damage. Now, when I was a child, that was not the definition of death, but this is the definition of death that is accepted pretty much throughout the world nowadays. The definition of death was changed because of medical technology, specifically heart transplants. The first heart transplant was not performed in the United States. It was performed in South Africa by Dr. Christian Barnard. The reason for that is it would have been illegal to perform a heart transplant in the United States at that time, because the definition of death that was accepted by the medical and scientific community in this country was the cessation of a heartbeat and respiration. South Africa had agreed to brain death as a definition for death, and this allowed a body to be kept technically alive. Blood was circulating, breathing was going on, and this made it possible to harvest the heart from a body. The transplant was successful. The patient lived for a while. His body rejected the new heart, but they developed various medicines that help a patient accept a transplanted organ. And they discovered that it is not just the heart, but there are other organs that can be transplanted from a body. If we can just keep the respiration going and the heartbeat going, we can take lungs, we can take livers, we can take hearts, we can take all sorts of things. And so there was pressure to change the definition of death throughout the Western world. And there was some debate about this, but the debate was more or less settled when the Pope waded in. The Vatican said that brain death was an acceptable definition. And so with religious sanction, the debate virtually went away. And brain death has come to be the accepted definition of death pretty much everywhere in the world. And this allows for the transplanting of organs that could not otherwise be transplanted. Persistent vegetative state, PVS, is not the same as brain death. This results from severe damage to the cerebral cortex, the front part of the brain, which controls cognitive function. And people in this condition have been referred to very unkindly as vegetables. And there have been some very famous court cases where someone is suing to have life support taken away from such patients so that they can die a natural death. Just let nature take its course. The most famous of these cases was the Thiroux case. The President of the United States waded in, the courts waded in, and finally, in a lawsuit between Thiroux's husband and her parents, the husband won. The feeding tubes and the hydration were disconnected, and she died several days later. Now, the issue has become a little more complex because new technology has shown us that people in persistent vegetative states are not really vegetables. There seems to be an aware of thinking. Other parts of the brain apparently take over some cognitive function. And with computer technology, it has become possible to communicate to people in a persistent vegetative state and get some simple yes or no answers. So there seems to be an awareness of surroundings, and there is still some cognition going on in there. This has raised some issues that have moved an issue that seemed to be settled off of the back burner and back onto the front burner. Might it be possible in the future for someone in a persistent vegetative state to decide for themselves and make their will known? It might be that someone would say, I want to continue my life. Thiroux's parents argued that she did, and they saw some response to their presence. Perhaps that is so. It was impossible to determine that at the time. But with new technology, it might be possible for someone like a Terry Schiavo to say, I want to live. Or conversely, I want the tubes removed so that I can die a natural death. Let's let death take its course. Or in a state that allows for assisted suicide, a patient might opt for that. So persistent vegetative state is still an issue when we talk about the matter of when it is appropriate to end a human life. I want to comment briefly on the current legal status of mercy death and mercy killing. Presently, assisted suicide is legal in 3 states, Oregon, Washington, and Montana, and it has been available for years in several European countries. Mercy killing, active euthanasia, is illegal in the U.S. and most countries throughout the world, and so it is not openly practiced, but sometimes it is performed without the knowledge of the authorities. Let's talk now about allowing someone to die. This problem became crucial in the 20th century because of the availability of advanced life-saving and life-supporting technologies and procedures. These same technologies that made it possible for us to extend the biological life of a person so that organs could be harvested can also be used to prolong the biological life, and what we mean here is the breathing and the beating of the heart, pretty much indefinitely. So when the tubes are hooked up, when do you take them out? Should you hook them up? Is it appropriate just to allow death to take its course, nature to take its course? The author's value of life principle says we need to revere life, but we also need to accept death. And the question with allowing someone to die is, at what point do we accept the inevitable? You know, statistics show that 10 out of 10 people are going to die. So at what point do we say, it's time to let it happen? There were arguments against allowing someone to die, allowing nature to take its course. Some people said you're just abandoning this person to die. But our authors point out that this doesn't need to be the case, and they make a distinction between curing and healing and comforting and caring. Medical technology allows us to do both, and medical professionals are skilled at both. We go to a doctor, we have something wrong, we're looking for a cure, and there are medicines and there are technologies out there that can do that for us. But there comes a time when the doctor says there's nothing more we can do for you as far as healing or curing you is concerned. We can't cure this disease. But what we can do is we can control the pain and we can care for you as you make your exit from this world. The authors make a good point here. Medical technology cannot do everything. And there comes a point when we have done all we can do. The patient cannot be made whole again. They cannot be cured. At that point in time, it just makes sense that the medical procedures performed and the medicines prescribed are going to serve a different purpose. Another argument against allowing someone to die is, yeah, you let them die and tomorrow they find the cure. Well, that is a concern. My father-in-law years and years ago died, and just shortly after he passed, there was a medical procedure that came online that would have saved his life. He died as a result of complications following a surgery. So Could they have kept him alive? Actually, they could not have. The technology was not good enough to do it. If we had been able to foresee the future and had there been technologies available, it might have been feasible then, and it might have been sensible to put him in a medically induced coma and wait for that miracle cure to come online. But of course, you don't know those things. And someone says, well, we may find a cure, but we may not. So do you let your hope for a medical miracle determine the proper treatment for a person who, based on what we know today, is beyond cure? Another argument against allowing someone to die was we can never choose life over death. And the response to that is we don't have a choice. Again, the statistics are in. 10 out of 10 people die. It's not that as though we can choose to live indefinitely. At some point in time, something is going to take us. And when a person is terminal, and when there is nothing more that the doctors can do to cure them of whatever they are suffering from, you have no choice at that point in time. A patient in that situation is going to die. The only choice is, do we continue to perform all sorts of procedures that are not going to work? Do we continue to prescribe all sorts of medicines that are not going to solve the problem? In fact, some of these may make dying more painful and prolong the process of dying. Or do we, at some point in time, say, we'll keep this patient as comfortable as we can possibly keep him and allow nature to do what nature always does? You know, we're in this war against gravity. We fight it when we're kids. We learn to hold our heads up. We finally learn to crawl. We finally learn to walk. But eventually gravity wins. That's just the way it is. Medicine, it's been argued, must save lives, not end them. Well, that would be a better argument for assisted suicide or mercy killing. Because in the case of allowing someone to die, medical professionals are doing nothing one way or the other. They're just allowing nature to take its course. And as the authors point out, there's a difference between that and these heroic efforts to try to prolong the inevitable. So the authors' first principle of their moral system is that we should revere life. But there comes a time when we have to accept death. And accepting death as inevitable is not choosing it. If we could choose other, chances are we would do so. But there is going to come a time when we will not have a choice. There is a theological argument against allowing someone to die. Some have argued that it interferes with God's divine plan. The authors of our textbook ask, what constitutes interference? Isn't any cure arguably interference with God's plan? A person has cancer, a surgery is performed, the cancer is removed. Is that interfering with God's plan? Allowing someone to die when the time comes, is that interfering with God's plan? Or should we then use every medical technology available to us to prolong the inevitability of that person's death, which is interference with God's plan? And the authors of our textbook make a good point here. I suppose there would be some who would be very dogmatic on this particular issue and would say we reject any medical treatment whatsoever. We're going to live by faith, and of course they have the privilege of doing that in this country. But as a former minister, I would have to say that I would view the advances in technology as arguably a part of God's plan too. And I think it would be morally acceptable to avail ourselves of various technologies if those technologies are designed to cure or to make us, at least in some degree, whole again. Let me give you a personal illustration. There is, in our day and time, a lot of debate about vaccines. I, for one, am all for them. Why? Well, I wouldn't be talking to you right now were it not for a vaccine. Because when I was about 2 years old, I was diagnosed with polio. I came down with polio the same year that the vaccine came out. And so the problem was dealt with. Had it not been dealt with, I would have died some time ago. And so did my parents interfere with some divine plan by allowing the doctors to give me injections that dealt with my polio? I would argue that perhaps, and I hope this is true, that the cure was a part of the plan, because I'm still here, and I was a pastor for 40 years, so I spent an awful lot of time doing the Lord's work. So I would say that I can respect someone who says this is my sincerely held religious view. I am going to deny myself the right to avail myself of the various medical technologies that are out there. Fine. But I think that is a minority position held by very few. The arguments for allowing someone to die are these. Individuals have rights over their own bodies, lives, deaths. This is the author's freedom principle, the argument that we have a right to set our own course, to make our own moral choices, so long as we subscribe to 4 basic principles. As long as we are basically good people on all other matters outside of those 4 areas, we can be the master of our fate and the captain of our soul. The author points out, though, that this freedom has never been viewed as an unlimited freedom. Patients, the authors say, have a right to refuse treatment, and we should not overrule this right. Treatment often will not cure the problem, and sometimes the cure is worse than the disease. Another personal example from my ministry had a very close friend, an older gentleman, who had lymphoma, and it's treatable. And his family encouraged him to take the chemo treatments and to be cured of the cancer, and it worked. But he told me off the record, if it ever comes again, I am not going to do this again. The cure is so difficult that I think I'm ready to go ahead and let nature take its course, should this ever reappear. His argument was the cure may not be worse than the disease, but it's pretty close, and I don't want to go through it twice. Does a patient have a right to refuse treatment? Well, we have determined in our culture that indeed they do. Another argument for allowing nature to take its course is allowing someone to die will shorten the suffering. The counter-argument is that, yeah, but it may shorten their life. We could prolong their life by doing things that are not going to cure them. The argument is, yeah, but at what cost and suffering? If we cannot cure the person, why would we extend the physical suffering of their body? Another argument for allowing someone to die is patients have a right to die with dignity. The phrase dying with dignity, however, can be used as one of those euphemisms. And the authors of our textbook acknowledge that it is possible that people would be abandoned, that assisted suicide would be performed, or even euthanasia. So they point out that die with dignity is kind of a term that is a Trojan horse. It may have critters in it that you are not aware of. And as a culture accepts the idea of dying with dignity, that phrase can be used to bring in all sorts of other things that society might not be as comfortable with as allowing someone to die when the time comes. At this point, we need to consider a couple of additional terms: ordinary and extraordinary means. Extraordinary means is a term we use to refer to efforts to keep a person alive. That person may be a grave burden to his or herself or to others. And in different circumstances and different places and in different times, that burden may be seen as appropriate or inappropriate. When we talk about extraordinary means, we're talking about radical surgeries, radiation therapies. You could add chemotherapies, respirators, heart machines. All these things are extraordinary means. And again, at some point in time, they may be appropriate. A patient may be severely injured in an accident, and it's a burden to go through the pain involved in recovering from that accident. But through radical surgery, through therapies, physical therapies afterwards, keeping that person alive with a respirator so that surgeries can be performed. All these things are certainly going to be burdensome to the family. But when there's a hope that at the end of the carrying of this burden, that person is going to be restored to some measure of health, then most families would say it is worth the effort. Yes, let's use the respirator. Yes, let's have that surgery. And we're going to encourage our loved one to go through that therapy. Those are extraordinary means. But there are other times when you might say, well, do we do this? This person is beyond cure. What is to be gained by this surgery? What is to be gained by using a respirator in this circumstance? The other term we want to look at here is ordinary means. And this would be difficult to define. But for a terminally ill patient, we would say we don't use those extraordinary means unless using them would help control pain or other symptoms. A person might, for example, be in great pain, and a surgery would cause them not to be in that great pain. The surgery would not cure them, but it would be useful in pain control. And so ordinary means might suggest that the surgery is appropriate. So what you are asking yourself when you're talking about ordinary means is, what is going to help this patient die the most painless death possible? Obviously, you're going to have real questions here about hooking up a respirator. That would prolong the breathing, and that would prolong the biological life of the body. But to what end? So those are extraordinary and ordinary means. Someone comes into the hospital, medical professionals have to sometimes make that decision very quickly. What do we do here? What should we do? Should we hook up the respirator? Can this patient be cured? And that, in the past, has created enormous difficulty, and it can do so in the present. We'll talk about how we as a culture have dealt with the problem in just a minute. But there are two other terms that we use nowadays instead of extraordinary and ordinary means. And I think these terms are better: appropriate and inappropriate. It's the idea, given the patient's condition and prognosis, what would be the appropriate treatment of this patient? And we would say, in some cases, for example, it would be inappropriate for us to use a respirator given the nature of this patient's injuries, it would be appropriate for us to keep this patient as comfortable as possible, because prolonging his death would do no good, because there is nothing we can do for him. Now, our culture dealt with this particular problem, the allowing someone to die problem, and they dealt with it, I believe, very effectively. And religious thinkers are comfortable with it. The Vatican is fine with it. Protestants are fine with it. You know, we look at our Congress and we say they can never get anything right. We look at maybe the president's office. We say they never get anything right. But there have been occasions when they have actually come together and solved problems. And the Patient Self-Determination Act was one of those rare occasions. This was an act that was passed with great bipartisan support and signed into law. And it gave patients a number of rights. It's sometimes referred to as the Patient's Bill of Rights. Among these rights are, one, the right to considerate and respectful care. Now, a lot of medical professionals wish that they had a right to respectful treatment from their patients and consideration from their patients, but it is a one-way street. Your doctors and your nurses have an obligation to treat you respectfully and with care. You as a patient have a right to make decisions involving your health care. You can say, I'm not going to go through this treatment. Sorry. I know you want me to go through chemo this second time, but I'm not going to do it. And this was huge, the forming of advanced directives and the appointing of a surrogate. What we're talking about here is living wills and durable powers of attorney. And it is pretty much impossible to check into a hospital for an elective procedure without one of these things on file. You're supposed to bring it with you. And the idea is, in a time when you are not terminal, you make some decisions concerning your health care. And if a part of that is you recognize that you may someday be in a position where you're not able to make medical decisions for yourself. And so you have a right to designate someone to make those decisions for you. You also have the right to acquire information in order to make treatment decisions. Doctors have to tell you what they think should be done, what they believe the benefits would be, and what the risks are. And you have a right, of course, to get a second opinion if you should so choose. But it follows logically. If I'm going to be making decisions involving my health care, then I need complete and accurate information so that I can make a wise decision. There's been something else that's come online that has impacted this discussion of allowing nature to take its course. And that thing that has come online is hospice. It was the Catholic Church that first really presented hospice as an option to members of the Catholic faith. One of the most famous of all hospice providers was Nobel Prize winner Mother Teresa. Hospice is a service or ministry that cares for the dying. The hospice approach, the authors write, can solve most of the problems surrounding allowing someone to die. And they say it can eliminate the necessity for mercy death, assisted suicide, and mercy killing. Now, someone might say, wait, you're kind of getting ahead of yourself there, Mr. Thiroux and Krasemann. You haven't yet shown that assisted suicide and mercy killing is a necessity. So maybe we should wait till after we have that argument before you just throw out the idea that there are cases in which this is a necessary thing. Just point out that they're getting a little ahead of themselves and tipping their hand as to where they are going to land on a couple of controversial issues we're going to be discussing as part of this chapter. But certainly, hospice has solved a lot of the problems surrounding the issue of allowing someone to die. Hospice emphasizes comforting and caring for the patient. Hospice is called in when the patient can be cured, can't be healed. What do? You call in hospice, and hospice then takes over to provide comfort and care. Hospice normally employs a team approach. You have medical professionals, you have grief counselors, mental health professionals, clergy, the patient's family. And so the patient's treatment as they approach the end is discussed and treated from a number of different angles. The team approach provides support for both the patient and the family, because it's recognized that, first of all, when we come face to face with our own mortality, that's a tough pill to swallow, and we may need some support, and we may need to talk through some issues, but so will our family, and so will our friends. So the team approach provides that kind of support. The focus is on pain and symptom control, allowing a person to die in a natural setting possible. This approach, because there is a commitment to allowing a person to pass in a home-like atmosphere, we'll try to utilize home care whenever possible. If it is necessary for someone to go into a hospice facility, and there are a number of very good ones, these facilities try to provide a home-like atmosphere to humanize the whole situation, so that you're not in that sterile hospital type environment. And hospice also provides help to families so that there is a freedom from financial worry for both the patients and their families. So hospice is a service that recognizes the truth of the statistic I've quoted a couple times: 10 out of 10 people die. And so when it comes a person's time, hospice tries to be there to make that final chapter as bearable as possible. To this end, hospice provides bereavement counseling before the patient's death, because there is a mourning process that goes on there, and then to the families after the death. The goal is natural death with peace and as much dignity as possible. And then the authors repeat, it alleviates the need for mercy, killing, and death. Again, who says there is a need for either of these things? Isn't that what the debate is all about? And yeah, that is what the debate is all about. But you see the authors kind of putting their thumb on the scale here. Now we come to assisted suicide, mercy, death. The arguments against it are similar to the arguments we looked at when we talked about non-assisted suicide. Can a patient ever rationally choose this? And we argued when we talked about suicide that you may disagree with the result of the rational process, but certainly you cannot argue that people cannot rationally make this choice, and many have done so. There was a young woman who became kind of a Facebook sensation as she decided that she was going to end her life on a certain day because she had a terminal illness. And when that day approached, she didn't want to do it, but she got a lot of pressure, which you can say maybe that wasn't right, but she got it anyway to follow through with her plan, and she did. You could argue that she made the wrong choice, but the argument she made when she announced that she was going to go ahead and end it on a day certain, those arguments were certainly rationally based. The religious argument, again, the religious person would normally say that it's not your choice playing God. God is the giver of life, and God is the one who decides when a life should end. The arguments against that have already been discussed when we talked about suicide. I'm not going to make them again here. The domino arguments, we've talked about those arguments as well. The justice argument's largely negated here as long as the family is on board with the decision. Very controversial issue in our time, as you have traditional religious morality doing battle against a scientism or a secular view of morality. Who are we as human beings? Are we just biological machines? Are we just animals? Or is there something more to human life? That is ultimately the debate, and it is still going on. 3 states have had referendums about this issue, and in 3 states it has been determined that this is a service that would be made available to people upon their request. This has created another problem, though, for medical professionals that disagree. Say you are a Roman Catholic doctor and you believe that taking someone's life is a mortal sin. Should you then be forced to provide that service? Should a nurse that believes the same thing be required to risk her eternal soul to comply with the law of the land? That is not so much a debate yet here, but it is a debate that it happened in Great Britain within the last year. Can a medical professional deny a medical service to someone when the state has determined that the patient has a right to that service? So you can see, even if you decide that, yeah, I'm okay with assisted suicide, there are other moral issues connected to that issue that are not tangential, that are very serious for many people. I think the authors of our textbook would agree that this is the best argument against mercy death or assisted suicide. We have hospice, and it provides an alternative. If the patient is concerned about the pain and suffering of their approaching death, hospice provides an alternative to that. But the argument based on the freedom principle and the autonomy of the person, the right of a person to be the captain of their fate and their master of their soul, is that, but what if I don't want that? This debate is an ongoing debate in our culture and probably will be for years to come. The United States is becoming less and less traditional religious, and so we can anticipate that mercy death is no doubt going to become more and more accepted in our culture. But there are other problems. Some of these problems have turned up in the Netherlands, for example, where they actually have been able to have hidden cameras confirm that some people pressure their elderly parents into going ahead and ending it so that the inheritance is not eaten up through prolonging the life of that elderly parent in a nursing home. So there are all sorts of considerations to be considered. But there are some powerful arguments, of course, for mercy death. The big one the author mentioned is their freedom principle. Their argument is that other than a few basic areas, a person gets to be God. You religious people say we're playing God. Well, not everyone believes in God. And so minus God, the patient is going to have to make the decisions that heretofore were left to a divine being. And they have indeed the right to be the captain of their fate and the master of their soul. And then there is the argument that we do this routinely for animals, shouldn't we provide our fellow human beings at least as much consideration and mercy? Well, the religious argument against that, of course, a Roman Catholic priest would argue, is it mercy to enable someone to commit a mortal sin and thereby damn their soul to eternal damnation? Again, the argument is largely, and a lot of the arguments in our time are between traditional religious morality on the one hand, which is still held to some degree by the majority of people in this country. And on the other hand, you have scientism and a secular view of morality. And so you have a conflict between these two worldviews. Divine rule non-consequentialism can be quickly dismissed in an ethics textbook, but it is not so easily dismissed when you have about 70% of the country that still holds to some form of religious-based morality, and some of them passionately so. The Catholic Church in particular, and certainly Protestant evangelicals, would be in agreement on many of these issues. And that is a large voting base, and that is a large group of people who are saying we do not want to create a culture of death, and we see this as just another brief stop on the slippery slope that society sets itself on once it begins to allow the indiscriminate taking, or even begin to justify the discriminate taking of human life. As our culture has become more secular, there is certainly a change in attitude, even among people who hold to a religious traditional morality in other things, and more people are becoming comfortable with assisted suicide, mercy death. Even those who are members of the Catholic Church might disagree with their church on this particular issue. The change has come about as a result of a number of things. There have been strong advocates for assisted suicide. The issue became front page news. That was easy for me to say. It became front page news when Robert Kevorkian, who liked to be called Dr. Death, forced the issue. He ended up in prison because he was euthanizing people that were not terminal. He just kind of got off on killing people when it came right down to it. But the issue then was elevated and began to be discussed. Court decisions upheld the right of patients in places such as Oregon to seek this service. The idea of the patient's right to choose, combined with the growth of acceptance of the author's freedom principle, all of this began to change the attitude. In addition, and I've confirmed this by talking to a number of the nurses who have taken this course, assisted suicide is practiced in this country almost every day, as perhaps a little too much morphine is given to a patient who is suffering and requests it. It happens. It's practiced. It's just not talked about. And again, going back to the freedom principle, the author ends there as a strong desire for greater autonomy. I want to be in control. I want to be the captain of my fate. I want to be the master of my soul. I ultimately want to be my own God in these matters. Now, those of you who have another God, feel free to go with whatever your God tells you to do. But as a person who doesn't believe in God, I want the right to make such decisions for myself. And so the debate goes. Mercy killing. Mercy killing is active euthanasia. The argument for mercy killing, and this is taking the life of a person without their consent, and we're talking about people here that may be in a persistent vegetative state, although, as mentioned, technology is making it possible for some of these patients to perhaps have a say in their own treatment in the future. But the argument is made here, well, that person's not really there anymore. If they were able to make the choice for themselves, they would choose not to be here. I wouldn't want to be in that situation, and I would make that choice. And the argument is that the author's argument that we must revere life would not apply, because the person in such a condition is not really alive anymore. They are just existing. And their existence is putting a strain on the financial resources of family and perhaps even society. This person may be on Medicaid, for example, or Medicare. And there is the emotional burden on the family. They're keeping this person alive with food and hydration. If we disconnect that, the person's going to dehydrate, they're going to starve to death. Why not just go ahead and give them an overdose of morphine and end it? That would be the argument for it. The authors of our textbook do not really provide any strong arguments against mercy killing. I want to present just a couple for your consideration as we close our discussion of this chapter. Mercy killing was practiced once before with tragic consequences. Talking about the Third Reich, and when we think of the Nazis, we think of the death camps, but long before the death camps, they were practicing mercy killing. Goebbels, the minister of propaganda, was putting together movies talking about useless eaters, people with mental challenges that were considered nothing more than a drain on society's resources and an emotional drain on their families. And as a result of this propaganda blitz, people that were not considered to be mentally worth living were rounded up and put to death. This was where the Nazis began to experiment with methods of mass extermination. And the domino argument would say, based on the example of history, that once society starts deciding who is worthy of life, and once a society begins to say we as a society are going to decide who lives and who dies, it just doesn't seem like we know when to quit. Who's next? Today we say it is okay for us to euthanize the terminally ill. Who next? The elderly? Those who have perhaps dementia and are in nursing homes, draining their resources, leaving their family without their inheritance. Are they next? And who after that? You see, these questions really come down to this. What kind of culture are we going to be? Now, in the name of mercy, one side of the political and moral spectrum is saying we want to be a society in which killing is accepted and permitted under certain circumstances, which we as a society will define. On the other side, you have those that would line up behind Pope John Paul II and say what you are creating in the name of mercy is a culture of death. And you don't know what you're messing with. You are opening Pandora's box. And once you've opened it, you're going to discover that you're not going to be able to get it shut. So that would be the argument on the other side. You will be wrestling with these issues as an adult, as our culture will be wrestling with these and other bioethical issues in days to come. because the great ethical debates of our time are in the area of bioethics. Our technology has increased faster than our wisdom. And our technologies are creating all sorts of moral dilemmas that were not there 50 years ago. And as technology advances, more and more moral dilemmas are going to be created. This is going to be the battlefield, the moral and ethical battlefield, probably for the next century or more. And the question really is, what kind of culture are we going to be? And you will be part of that debate, and you will ultimately be making that decision.